after a breach is something that's really important, and it's something that we really need to spend more time thinking about. It's not only the technical response, but also the social technical response that's important. And that is what my talk is going to be about today. So I'm really honored to speak to you here today. So I'll just kick things off now. So you would have seen these circulated, and they'll be available in that there's kind of two bits of outputs, let's say, that contribute to this talk. One is an academic paper. So I am an academic, but this session I wanted to pitch it towards organizations, so to management in particular, because the research really is squarely towards you all. So here's just some quick links where you can actually find a preprint of the paper, you can find the official paper, and you can also find a white paper that I've created, which summarizes the work that I'm going to present today. So firstly, let's start off with a quote. So, let's kind of look at the reality of this. And the reality of this comes down to, I think this is a perfect quote, and it really hints on the importance and the reality that today, it's not, the unfortunate reality is that even though we will try to prepare for a breach as best as possible, one of the realities is that breaches happen. We can try our hardest, but we need to be successful all of the time. Attackers just need to be successful once. So therefore, the numbers are stacked against us. And I think the reality comes out with this quote in that, it's really about, unfortunately, preparing for an attack happening. And what do you say, not only technically, but also socio-technically. Let's jump straight into this and look at some examples. This is an example from the UK. So as Sergio mentioned, I'm an academic based in the UK. And you can see, so TalkTalk, a big telecommunications provider, was breached back in 2015. And the article was released, and there was basically some press around it. And one of the kind of key quotes that a lot of people remember is the TalkTalk CEO mentioning, "I can't confirm a customer's data was encrypted." I think this is really interesting because it does highlight, at that point in time, they weren't sure that whether data was encrypted or not. And I know things have progressed since then. But another thing that we should really consider here is this. So this is not the highest quality image, but one thing I want to highlight here is, this person being very worried about the way how they found out about this breach, and figuring that actually TalkTalk should have contacted them and should have engaged with them more. So this is a really interesting thing, and as it looks around even the impact of social media today as it comes to breaches. Another breach, you would have all, I'm sure, heard about the Equifax data breach, and that was covered extensively in various different news outlets. Some of the more interesting things around it, once again, pertaining to comms, looking at the Wall Street Journal highlighting that it took them 6 weeks to disclose the attack, but also their questions really around how they actually went about communicating with others using separate domain names. There were even some reports saying that they mistakenly tweeted a phishing link, so not the correct link to the for customers and for stakeholders, anyone impacted. And then there was also so this is an image from Crime Zone Security, and what he mentions based on his research is that if you actually checked whether you were impacted on the phone versus on your computer, you would actually get different messages. So one was saying you're not impacted, the other one was saying that you may have been impacted. So once again, that highlights and it really kind of emphasizes this reality here about trying to get corporate communications right. And that brings me really to the kind of crux of the question which I want to pose to you today, and which we're discussing today. And that is, what does effective corporate communications and PR look like after an incident? Because it's really important, because when we think about this, we really need to try to figure out, well, what should you say, who should say, what's the best way, how quickly should you come forward? All these things are really, really key, given the impact that they have on stakeholders, and of course, given the impact on things, considering things like laws, regulations, and so on. So the way how I went about this work is kind of in a typical academic fashion. I will stick out the kind of boring academic bits. But the point here is that what we tried to do was we tried to explore what was best practice in research. So basically, what was the research saying how you should respond when it comes to data breaches, and what you should say corporately, and what you should say generally to the public, for example, and to customers. And then we also try to look at best practice based on a number of real world security incidents. So these were incidents where a company was breached. There was some mention in the public domain, and we actually looked and tried to monitor what did the company say, how did they say, and how was the response perceived by some security professionals and experts. And then what we did was we combined two of these different areas, So we looked at the academic best practice, we look at industry best practice, we combined these, we evaluated and we compared and contrasted, tried to extract some best practice guidance. So we're trying to really pull from both fields here, and to try to then develop and evaluate a framework. And the framework is really the thing that we're proposing in this research. So I'll go through just some of those two initial bits, and then we'll kind of go through the framework towards the end of the talk, or to the middle or end of the talk. So in terms of the initial part, just thinking about themes and best practices. So from an academic perspective, one thing that was really interesting, that academic work focuses or has focused quite a bit on what was the stock market's reaction after a breach. So it's almost the kind of key, what was the knee-jerk reaction? So this company, this organization was breached, what happened in the stock market? And what we saw there was often, of course, there's almost an immediate drop or immediate impact on the stock market. But what we saw was that often in many cases, especially if the company survived, that long-term, the impact would actually tail off, in that you could almost not see it in many cases. There was also a massive emphasis on legal requirements to notify, and this of course makes perfect sense, because when we think about it, there is really, the way how you go about breaches and what you need to respond with, how you need to respond, a lot of this is actually governed by exactly what are the regulations in the particular part of the world where you are in, because they will often tell you, you need to notify by this time, you need to notify these individuals, and so on. Message framing was another big point. That was also about how do you actually communicate a message. There's a massive emphasis on protecting reputation, and probably that's not very surprising, especially given the type of organization you might be. You might be very focused on, well, how do we actually go about and what do we say to protect our reputation? Negative emotions and complexity of outsourced functions is also another thing that I'll come on to a bit later on. But so basically, so from analyzing those kind of key themes in the research, what we then try to do is to try to extract a number of best practices. Like I mentioned before, we were expert academic research just for the fun of it. We were really trying to get to the detail in terms of what are the best practices from academic research about what companies should say or how they should act after a breach. And what we found was that there was one of the key points was this idea of demonstrating a commitment to stakeholders, in that if you're being breached, the important thing is for you to actually be able to first, almost come clean and say, okay, we've been breached, and here is what we're going to do in response. Here's what we're going to do to ensure that we're going to keep your data safe, or that we're going to keep our interactions with you safe or secure going forward. So that was a really key thing, kind of this focus on addressing the problem. A lot of stakeholders expected you to do that. The multi-jurisdictional complexity, like I mentioned before, that was massive, and that's one of the key best practices we try to focus on. In the reality that after a breach occurs, you have to stop and pause and consider, okay, where are the various individuals that have been impacted by this breach? Because of course, you might have individuals across the world, and then what are the kind of legal requirements based on where that individual or those individuals are. So that's also another key component. We also have this idea of message framing, like I mentioned above. It's really important. I mean, I've seen a number of cases where organizations have focused on, let's say, getting the message out as quickly as possible, and the message is framed in a way that only technical individuals can understand it. But you really need to consider who are the target group that you're going after, and what are the key things you want to tell them. So framing, this idea of framing is critical. And really interesting from academia, there was a large focus on blaming the attacker. So kind of almost publicly saying, well, yes, we've been breached, but it was those bad attackers over there. It wasn't really our fault. And then the last one, kind of this idea of beware of the emotional impact. And I think this goes back actually based on the earlier tweet that I showed you above, which actually focused on the reality that some people can get really upset after a data breach. And even if individuals haven't been impacted financially, there's kind of an emotional impact that also is an emotional impact or harm that's also important, which we need to consider. Now, the next thing I want to talk to you about, so we covered the academic side of things. So of course, I'm sure many of you out there are that practitioners, and you really care about what happens for the practitioner side of things. So what we did was we actually, we tried to focus on a number of different breaches. You can see the organizations that we focused on your screen now on the left. And so we looked at various different companies as you see here. And then what we tried to look at was, firstly, all these companies have been breached, I should have said. So we looked at the incidents around these companies. And then we tried to look at, okay, well, here are the incidents surrounding these companies. How have they responded, and how was that response actually perceived by key individuals in industry? And I say key individuals, meaning individuals such as the individuals you can also see on screen. So we looked at Schneider on security, Krebs on security, Troy Hunt, We Live Security, and all of these. We chose these in particular because these are well recognized as kind of key people in the security field, in the security domain. So we wanted to see what was their thoughts on these various breaches. So now jumping directly to the theme, the key things that came out from our analysis. So we recognize that this idea of credibility of statements is really important. So looking at the fact that you have to release statements, of course, but you have to release statements that are actually believable and that don't just almost try to put a plaster on the wound. Next, this idea about downplaying. So one thing we recognized was that in many cases, organizations would try to downplay a breach. So they would say, oh, well, yes, the breach happened, but maybe it was only 1,000 records, or maybe it was only 10,000 records. Well, we actually processed millions of records. This idea of downplaying was not really looked upon well at all. It's almost seen as you need to understand and appreciate that when an organization or individual gives you their data, if that data is breached or lost, you really need to understand the importance of that data to the individual and show that importance publicly. And that also touches on my other point, i.e. this reality of focusing on the customer. The customer is really important as well. Of course, not disclosing and delaying is a massive question. And one of the poll questions I'm asking you, one of the key realities is, many of them would be saying, well, yeah, okay, in the case of a breach, do you wait, for example, until you figure out exactly what's happened and don't say anything, even if there's if people suspect that there's breach, or do you kind of report, publicly immediately? These are all kind of important questions which we come on to a bit later. Admission of responsibility is another interesting one, simply because that touches on the reality that in many cases, organizations actually don't want to accept responsibility and they want to blame the attacker. But in what we found based on our research is that stakeholders and customers, they actually appreciate it more when the company accepts some responsibility, because at the end of the day, that the data was given to the company, the data was given to the organization to keep, to work with, to secure, and the organization has lost that data. And then this last point about previous data breaches, and this came up in particular when the reality was a company was breached maybe for the second or third time, yet they were still releasing in their statements, we really take security very, very seriously, but that actually acted to antagonize individuals simply because if you take security seriously, how is this your third or second or third breach of customer data? So from those themes, what I tried to do then was extract a number of kind of key best practices, similar to what we did with the academic work before. So here you see kind of 4 key ones that I present. One looks at being prepared. And the point here is that you need to actually have relevant statements that you can actually release and be often beforehand. There should never be a case where a breach has happened and you are now thinking and drafting up from the beginning a statement. You should have kind of templates of statements that you should have prepared. And these should also be based on facts and based on the realities, because people will investigate them. This point of accepting responsibility, this came up as a massive, a large point from the industry focused work, in that this point about blaming the hackers was not really seen as a good approach at all. It just was not seen. This kind of idea of playing victim wasn't seen as a good approach, and actually didn't do companies well in the media. The third one, looking at this point about looking at trying to put active measures in place. So if a breach occurs, thinking clearly about, well, what are the type of ways in which you can actually secure individuals' data, whether it's credit monitoring, whether it's implementing two-factor authentication, anything like that, that can ensure that firstly, you're communicating to customers and stakeholders what you're doing to resolve and to deal with the breach. And then secondly, to actually ensure that they're aware that you're trying to prioritize their protection. That's very, very important. And then the last point, and this is probably the most contentious of the points, so I'm sure many of you will probably catch it with me later to discuss in the Q&A on the website. this point about, so we advertise this kind of, or I should say the industry where advocates rather, notifying customers and stakeholders sooner rather than later. So not taking weeks to notify, but notifying sooner rather than later. And I'll come on to the reason for this a bit later. So then what we did was, of course, we have two sets of best practices. We have academic best practice, we have industry best practice. What should we do? So in many cases, what was great was that academic and industry best practice actually aligned perfectly. So we were able to kind of take these two things and combine them. Then we also had cases where there were different things that were so we had some from academic, some from non-academic that we were able to combine. And then we also had communication and messaging. And then the last point was there's some areas that actually didn't map well. So communication didn't map with, so sorry, on the left, academics recommending that maybe blaming the attacker, industry and best practice suggesting that's not a great thing. So in those cases, we basically tried to pick one that we thought had the strongest argument, and we went, for example, for accepted responsibility. So from that work, we came up with an initial framework, as you can see here. But then what we did quickly was we kind of reached out to a number of kind of key stakeholders, and what we did was we tried to engage with them, and we tried to get their feedback into the research. And here you can see a number of the key individuals. Well, they're anonymized data. So we had 13 individuals, but we had individuals that were kind of very senior in organizations, so chief risk officers, head of information security, CISOs, directors, and so on. And these were largely from security organizations, and you can see some quite large organizations. But also we have some key people involved in this, crisis response. So people that you actually get to call in cases when there is actually a breach. And so we refined the framework based on that. And the framework now is what I'm going to carry you through now. So there are a number of kind of key areas or key steps of the framework. I broke it down into kind of two main areas. There is one, which is pre-event. So what you should do before an event occurs. And then secondly, there is post-event. So in the pre-event setup, what we do is we have a number of key things that you need to establish. So you need to establish, you need to consider what are your priorities after an incident occurs. We need to consider what are the gaps. You need to consider and maintain communication. You need to look at incorporating partners and performing regular testing. And let's see. And this basically just jumps into that in a bit more detail, but I'm just giving you a whistle-stop tour because all of this is available to you offline. So this is kind of in general pre-event what's needed. And this is more information on pre-event what's needed. So in terms of the partners, the communication, the rehearsals, and so on. Then in terms of the actual crisis response, you also have a number of different things you need to consider. So you need to consider, if a breach happens, is a disclosure mandatory? What do you need to consider? Establish what you need to disclose, and so on. So these are some of the key points. There's also the framing the message. So framing the message is already all about accepting responsibility, we suggest, avoid downplaying, and also other things such as taking into account age, gender, and different things such as that. And also, as we kind of emphasize here, avoid blaming the attackers. We also need to think very carefully about how you actually choose to disclose. So choose when to disclose and select how to disclose. So you need to be thinking very clearly about when to disclose. So we often suggest notify quicker rather than later because that helps to kind of avoid the offset of people being actually very upset. There's also this idea of direct versus indirect communication. Of course, direct communication has many benefits. So for example, email has many benefits and surface mail might have many benefits, but there might also be some disadvantages to that which you need to consider. And the same thing for indirect communication, as we kind of delve into more detail here. And then we also have this idea of kind of preparing for reaction in terms of you need to brief staff. There were a number of cases where staff weren't briefed, that the message wasn't delivered well. So these are also kind of key things you need to be thinking about. Keep it simple, avoid jargon, and so on. And this is the last slide, really. And I just want to say very briefly that this work has had really good take up in the information security industry. There's a number of people reached out. We want to look some awards for this work as well. So we do believe that there's a massive impact and a massive potential for the work. And as much as possible, I'm really happy to collaborate and to engage with anyone that may be interested. So thanks very much for attending my talk, and thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Jason. I think this is really solid work, and I appreciate the it's not just a long academic paper, but you also present the kind of workflows that make it easier for us to create these playbooks. So much appreciated. I recommend everybody goes to Work Adventure, where speakers will actually be available for Q&As, and Jason published his contact details. I'm sure he's happy to reach out if you reach out to him. Thanks a lot for presenting and taking the time. And so then let me just jump over to our next speakers. It's welcome Andras and Alexander. These two gentlemen barely need an introduction. I mean, they're kind of the rock stars in security and open source. I'm kind of honored to be their moderator. I think anyone who's hasn't heard of these two people probably is completely new to FIRST and new to the field. Andras and Alexander have been working at Circle, and they're kind of the brains and the engines, not only the brains, but also the engines behind MISP. And MISP has developed from something kind of an early thing to really a Swiss Army knife of solving a lot of our problems. And we're going to see how it's going to be solved in going to be deployed in something that you wouldn't really expect it to be used, even though it has to do with viruses, I'm told. Without further ado, I hand over to you. Thanks very much.
Oh, thank you, Serge. Thank you for this good introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today, and a bit sad today because we don't see each other. But if you have played with the virtual games of FIRST, you could maybe see some of us there playing around. Thank you very much. What we will do today is to present something that just happened to us some months ago. I would say more than even a year ago, about the pandemic and so on. And so Andras and myself will present what we did and how we, I would say, change a bit MISP and how we build the sharing communities around something that we were not expert in. So it was kind of a challenge for us at the beginning. So we came by creating a kind of COVID-19 MISP information sharing community, and it was a kind of experimental thing. So the session of today for us is an overview of what we did there. So first, there's a kind of cliff notes about MISP for the one that doesn't know MISP, but I think it will be very fast and quick because I think a lot of the first members are already familiar with MISP and all the open source projects that we're working on. But we will describe what we did exactly of building this community of COVID-19 community. So it's not only about the tooling and all the development that we did around the tools, but it's actually the I would say even the relationship and the creation of a community around it. And we will share all the interaction that we had with the people, the different organizations and so on to really build a community. And we want to really share with you. So we have a short session today of less than 30 minutes, but we will try to show to you what was really working for us and what didn't work. And we really hope to share some lesson learned with you. So it's really what we experienced. So again, we were not experts in the pandemic field, but we became a bit in while doing this community. So really, the origin of this community is like, I mean, it was like kind of a, I would say, reaction. So for us, a lot of things that we are developing is based on the fact that when we face an issue or we are facing or we are frustrated about something, we want to practically do something there, which is, I think, for us a kind of resilience to create some tools and so on. And as a CSIRT and as a day-to-day job, we have seen an increase of this kind of surface of attack for all those tools services and so on run by people because they were in a rush and they were starting to like roll out a lot of new services. And we have seen that it was like going up at the same time. Everyone as being human, I mean, we were facing this pandemic as a kind of new situation for us, and I think it was kind of a new challenge, not only on the professional side but on the personal side too. At the same time, there's this kind of surrounding chaos around it. A lot of adversaries, threat actors, and so on, are trying to abuse it. So it was kind of challenging, and in all this mess of people discussing and so on, we have seen a lot of initiatives popping up about sharing information and so on. So, I mean, it was kind of selfish for us, but we wanted to have at least one point at our place where we could collect the information, use it, see what are the current trends regarding not only the medical aspect, but all the cybersecurity aspect of this pandemic. And we started to discuss with a lot of people, and we have seen a different interest in different groups regarding potential sharing communities on COVID-19. So that's where everything started. So it's basically the origin of things. So we say, okay, maybe we should use MISP, and for the one that doesn't know, MISP is a platform, what we call nowadays a trade intelligence sharing platform. So really with a strong focus on the sharing aspect. And if we have to summarize the 4 key activities of MISP, is like ingesting data, processing this data to for example, structure in a command format to allow correlations, enrichment. So it's basically the classical trade intelligence process, or the intelligence process at large, that can be done using MISP. And then obviously you can use it to interact with people, to collaborate, contextualize, improve the information, and then disseminate the information. So if you're looking for a platform for building sharing communities, ISACs, and so on, it's basically the platform that you can use. It's fully open source. There are plenty of other things around MISP that we are maintaining, libraries, knowledge base, many best practices, and nowadays we have even a complete open source standard for the information sharing aspect. So everything is open source, so there's no hidden secret there. Everything can be accessible, modified, and so on, and by everyone. And this is basically maintained by us. So that's just a quick introduction of MISP and what we did there.
Yeah, and a little bit more about that. And there's also the MISP instance of FIRST. So if you're FIRST members and you're listening as a FIRST member, just authenticate with that, and it will create a user for you automatically, and you can get started with. And it's already a pretty broad sharing community with a lot of different users and organizations on there sharing their data. There's also something else that might be interesting. There's also the information sharing SIG, where there's a lot of discussions about information sharing in general, not just cyber threat information sharing, but also other types of information sharing. So you will see here as well that we were dealing with different types of information sharing altogether in this scenario, and these do come together at one point. We'll talk about that in a moment, though. Next slide, please. So a little bit about MISP that we also try to do over the years is we try to make the tool as flexible as possible. So we started out with this initial use case that we as a national CSIRT, we're basically working with cybersecurity cases almost entirely. So that means that our background and MISP's background as well is IT security first and foremost. With that said, though, over the years, it has evolved on being able to host different types of communities and different types of information sharing. For example, financial fraud information is being shared in specific financial sharing communities. You have law enforcement using it for border control, for monitoring seized goods, and for their forensic cases. You have all these different use cases with vulnerability management, and also for risk analysis. So you have a bunch of different types of users and communities involved, and that means that the data model aligns itself with these different types of models. So we wanted to have this flexibility in place. If you want to see some really exotic use cases, I think the craziest one we've seen so far was a sharing community where they were sharing radar waveforms. We have no idea why, but they had questions for us on how to model their data, and that's how we found out about it. Next slide, please. So going back to a little bit about the personal challenges, so Alex has already mentioned a little bit about why we started with this whole thing, but there were also a lot of personal frustrations for us. I mean, one of the most common one that I'm sure for all of you is the case was last year when it came to conferences like FIRST. Are we going to be able to travel there with COVID-19? What is the situation in given other countries where we might give trainings, where we might have to go for our jobs and so on? Can we actually travel? Are we safe? So these kind of questions were all in our mind, basically. And that's why we initially started. So the first use case for the COVID MISP instance was really the health information, to just see where we stand with the current pandemic. Keep in mind, this is early last year, when there weren't those fancy dashboards that are out there now all over the place that you can gather this information from. The ones that were out there were either very regional, like the one hosted by the Chinese government, which was actually really good for regional overview of, within China, but not so great if you wanted to see, for example, what was happening around Luxembourg. On the other hand, the ones that existed that were good, like the one from Johns Hopkins at the time, didn't have the capability to do filtering on only regions that you were interested in, for example. So we wanted to have something flexible there and wanted to put MISP to good use and test this flexibility, whether it was really as flexible as we claimed it was. So first of all, we had to overcome basically our own doubts and the doubts of our surrounding about us not having any expertise in this field at all. We knew information sharing, so that was the thing that we knew. So we wanted to apply that also to a different domain.
So the first thing that we decided to do is to look at MISP and how we could track the pandemic and what we need to modify in order to get ready and to have a COVID-19 MISP instance. The first thing that we needed to do is to have a complete new data model, and this complete new data model was super simple. As András mentioned, we have this flexible model in MISP that we are using for a lot of things, and so the thing is now that you can describe in the data model the health information, because we were capturing a lot of things regarding intelligence, cybersecurity, and so on, but not the health-related information. And another thing that we were looking for was finding the good data sources and a way to ingest them. So for example, the Johns Hopkins one were one of the very good data sources, and we were building scripts around it to be able to inject the data in there. And then there is this visualization aspect, like András was mentioning, I think it was quite important. At the early beginning, there were not that much dashboard that you can customize, for example, change input, the time series, and so on easily. So we wanted to change that in MISP. So, and we had to modify other things. So we set up MISP at the beginning. So we were like thinking that we were maybe only 10 or 20 people around it, but there's a constant growth of users from the early beginning. We have some statistics later that you will see. So we have to manage that. So we even extend a bit MISP to support that kind of thing. We will see that later. And another thing that we are very important to is to be able to manage this kind of group properly and to assign them to the proper organization and so on. Another thing that we have seen is we have to create what we call those kind of allo lists. And what was kind of positive effort that we have seen around the COVID-19 situation and so on is a lot of new domain names were popping up. Some were governmental, some were private initiative, some were scam. So, and how do you discuss all those ones? It was quite difficult. So that was the thing that we have to do too, and we were basically reusing some of the activities around that to have some allo lists. So the two main things that we did was to build our own connector to gather two main health-related sources. Don't forget, it was at the beginning of the pandemic, and only the two data sources were available and parsable and so on, was Johns Hopkins dataset and the Chinese governmental reporting. So we designed new object templates for those, and for the one that are familiar with MISP, it's like straightforward to do, and you see that it was like kind of for us a quick win because we were able to reuse that models to just create the JSON format. And we create some additional feed ingester. So we have this capability in MISP to ingest feeds for any kind of data. And it was supporting that. So just an example here, it's one of those object templates that we modify in MISP. It's something that I remember we did that during a military training that we did in Brussels. So we were doing the training, and at the same time we were working on the project, and we basically do those object template in a kind of, I would say, 1 hour. And we were structuring the COVID-19 daily report from John Hopkins into standardized MISP format, and it was like a kind of quick way to have those kind of COVID object templates.
Yeah, going back to what we actually lacked though at this point was really the dashboarding system. So one of the things that we wanted to have is something, first of all, that we can reuse later on for other use cases. Obviously, everything that we did was also to still be somehow attached to what we do day to day normally. We also wanted to have a system where it was easy to build and to manage the different widgets that we would create for the different use cases. Manage in a sense also that users would be able to customize how these widgets worked based on configurations, based on settings that they set up. So for example, for the COVID-19 case in particular, I myself am Hungarian, I'm living in Germany, and I'm working in Luxembourg. So obviously these 3 countries were of high interest to me. So that means that if I'm looking at the dashboard, these are the numbers that I'm most interested in, most likely, and perhaps the other neighboring countries. So I would want to create something that is catered to my own personal needs. And the other thing that we wanted to have something that adheres to the rules of the release model of MISP. So the idea was that we wanted to be able to share this dashboard to all other users of a MISP community, and they would be able to retrieve only the statistics and overview of data that they had access to in the first place from their user perspective. Next slide, please. So here's just a small image of what the COVID-19 dashboard looked like. So again, this is very customized for the COVID-19 instance. Obviously, if you're doing cyber threat intelligence, you will have different types of widgets to pick from that make more sense. But for this, it made a lot of sense for us. We could create regional hot zones basically via the geo view of the data. We could see numbers such as mortalities, confirmed cases, recoveries, and so on, and track those numbers in the various different countries. This was at the time when these numbers really played a role in where you were allowed to travel, for example, altogether. And then later on, of course, everything came to a grinding halt. But at first, I think we were a bit more optimistic when we came up with this. Next slide, please. So to put this into perspective, this entire thing for us, it was kind of a passion project that we mostly did outside of working hours, so weekends and evenings. And we ended up implementing everything that we needed for this first vision of what we wanted to do within 2 weekends and a few additional evenings. And we were actually quite surprised by how well it worked. We just put a tweet out. If anyone's interested, they can join us. And what we didn't expect was the flow of users that we received. So we had a massive influx of users, which immediately brought with itself additional issues that we didn't anticipate. For example, managing user accounts and giving access in MISP in general is normally something that we tie to a more formal process in general in other communities. Here, this was not the case. So we wanted to give access to anyone that was interested in the data, and we wanted to have something that is quick in order to registering this. So we needed a self-registration system that was obvious, otherwise we would get overloaded. And we needed to rely on organizations and for users to manage themselves and give access to their peers and so on. So we basically switched to using org admins wherever we could in this case, for those familiar with MISP. That's basically it.
Yeah, quick example of the self-registration, and this one was for us a quick win because we were day and night working on different projects, and during the evening working on that, we could not handle all the requests. So as Anders was mentioning, it was like a constant flow of user requests willing to register. So now you have this kind of simple self-registration scheme, and again, it's a very good I would say a lesson learned for information sharing communities. If you give an easy access to your community, you will get more people and more people are involved. And for us at the end, introducing such kind of new features help us to open this kind of functionality to other sharing communities where they have a very, I would say, lax or easy access to a specific sharing communities. So who was initially interested? And initially we were interested into people that have information about health-related information and so on. So we get a lot of people that were initially interested into this kind of dashboard and seeing the evolution and so on. But over the times, we see that those information sharing communities were better, more structured. So that means a dashboard about health and so on pop-ups everywhere. They were more coordinated, either at worldwide level, European level, and so on. So we have seen a kind of shift over the times where different kind of activities, or at least topics, were shared. One of these is basically health related, obviously, but knowing a bit of our backgrounds, cyber threat and cybersecurity related information was something that were like popping up more. And then two other topics were very common and started to really take over was the disinformation aspect, because during a specific period of times, we have seen a lot of disinformation. Before that, information, I think, has been widely distributed and more people have access to the knowledge about the pandemic and so on. A lot of disinformation was sent, and this kind of information were shared within that community. And then another thing that a lot of people were looking for was the official website to disambiguous the website from the government from the one that are not governmental one. And that's, I would say, four main categories, I would say, main pillar of information that we were sharing there. Just a quick graph, and this one is interesting because you quickly see a huge peak of requests at the early beginning. So we had like around 60, 70 people requesting access on a daily basis at the early beginning, and sometimes it was like a lot of people were asking for requests. Then yes, this kind of slows down over the time, and this one is interesting. What we have seen a continuous request of access. Recently, we have seen some organizations saying that they will stop providing feeds about COVID-19 and so on. But we still see a continuous interest for various reasons. We don't know what will be the state in the next month, which I think it's logical. Another thing that we have seen is a lot of academics and researchers who are interested to access the system to see an overall historical database and dataset. So we still give access to the COVID-19 MISP instance. We still give access to many people and organizations. And especially we were surprised to see more and more academic researchers getting access and using the data for more research.
Yeah. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about these different use cases and why they were interested and what they were looking for. So starting with the health use case from the get-go, this was the one that initially drove like the numbers of people to join the instance initially. So again, we were interested in travel times, about the risks that we were exposed to, and so on. But over time, this became a lot less relevant. So this was interesting in the beginning for the community when there was nothing else in place. But later on, you had all these really good national dashboards and so on that you had that provided way more information by having more data sources than us. So for example, later on, one of the things that became most interesting was number of vaccinations this year, for example. So this is something where national registers have the best information as opposed to these global ones, like the ones that we were using for the incident cases. So this changed a little bit over time, and we dropped the shift for the focus on this over time to focus more on the other pillars. With that said, there was still a lot of information shared about articles, reports about the topic, and so on. So it means that if something interesting new popped up, there was someone pushing data about it in the community. So those interested could still follow up on that data. Next slide, please. Alex? I think we might have lost Alex or myself. Alex, are you there? Hello? Did I disconnect or did Alex disconnect?
Yeah, he seems to have disconnected.
Okay, in that case, no worries. I can just share my screen and we can continue from there. Just one moment. Just a moment. Apologies. Internet is not playing along today. How do I share my screen? There we go. Can you see it?
Yes.
It's working. Okay, perfect. Now I just need to figure out how to go into full display mode here. Full screen mode, there we go. Okay, so where were we? Sorry about that. So let's continue where we left off. So going to the other pillar, talking about the cyber threat information sharing. Obviously, one of the biggest changes that we saw was the change to remote work for a lot of organizations, which basically meant that the moment you have remote work, it means that you're setting up new infrastructures for VPN and so on. And attackers started abusing this really heavily at the start. So obviously, when your remote work transformation project is led by COVID-19 as its project manager, then you're going to end up making mistakes and things get more rushed than normally something like this would happen at an organization. So with those new attack surfaces in place, basically, we wanted to have some way of informing and mitigating these sort of issues. So this is more aligned with our traditional use case of MISP. Again, the different organizations involved were CSIRT, SOCs, researchers. There were a lot of good communities popping up specifically to combat the situation. Like CTI League was really great with pushing out a lot of good information out there. And there were a lot of vendors as well that were integrating with the COVID-19 data that we had as well, and that were feeding on the data to produce it further and to share it further with their customers. So it was an interesting change for us at the time. Also, for the disinformation campaigns, we saw quite a bit of uptake, especially early on when all these different campaigns popped up with anti-Max marches, then later on the anti-Vaxxer movements and so on, COVID denials and so forth. And often there was a lot of political motivation behind this. There's a community called the COGSAC Collaborative that was putting a lot of research in this. And they basically also started sharing information via the COVID instance. So if you're interested in that, there's a link there. I highly recommend everyone to have a look at what they do. It's really interesting stuff. They ended up also implementing a lot of additional things for MISP, such as templates for social media sharing, so information sharing about social media accounts, posts, and so on. So all these things are now modeled in MISP and can be reused for other use cases too. Alex, I see you're back.
Yeah, so sorry, Zoom kicked me out. So this information, so we had a lot of group, and so Andras was mentioning COGSAC groups where they were like contributing quite a lot, and we have seen a lot of some early disinformation campaign, and I don't really want to talk that much about the disinformation campaign here, but just to show you that people were actively using a functionality in MISP that were used for forensic analysis for disinformation. So you see a timeline of all the activities of this campaign using the timeline activities of the post and so on, which basically is the functionality that we have in MISP for the forensic analysis. So we were quite happy to see reuse of existing functionalities in the system for finding this out. Next slide, please. Same with the operation grid log, and this one is interesting. So if you have access to the COVID MISP, and if you want to have a look at the data set there, we see that there's a lot of link between different groups and so on, and you can really create this kind of story behind. So we have this capabilities in MISP to connect the dots and connect those different objects that has been created, for example, by a different group of disinformation, talking about disinformation and so on. And you can really see the story, the complete story of what is Operation Gridlock, what they are trying to do and so on, by just looking at one single event, and you see the overall story behind. And that's quite interesting to see that you can really use the technique that you use in threat intelligence for describing other course of actions, and not only attacks, but disinformation, for example. Next slide, please. Same with correlation. This one is an interesting one for US members at first there. It's a correlation between a specific disinformation campaign and a specific link with the account of Rudy Giuliani. So you can really see the correlation between some actors that were like actively pushing information about disinformation, and you can really benefit from the correlation automatically, and you see this kind of things. Another thing that we have seen over the time in the COVID-19 MISP is this kind of overlap and your hybrid stuff coming up over the time. Next slide, please.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So just something else that came as a side note to this One of the things that we initially found out was that a lot of good resources were being blocked by the various different security vendors, because initially there was such an abuse of the COVID-19 situation. Anything with COVID-19 in the domain that was unknown basically for security vendors was basically blocked on a lot of tools and devices. But this was causing issues because you were blocking legitimate resources from your governments, from your various different agencies that are there to inform the community. So one of the initial efforts that started up was basically including a lot of these different sources as what we call warning lists in MISP. So basically these are lists of known goods that allow you to block those from being fed to your different protective tools. So there are several really good efforts to this. There was one from CTI League that was very comprehensive. Krasimir's list was really useful for detecting a lot of these known goods and excluding those from the export. So there was quite a few efforts around this as well. Now, a little bit quickly about some of the statistics that we've seen over the course of this little experiment. We ended up with 1,600 users from over 300 organizations, with over 10,000 separate data packages being shared, be it health-related, cybersecurity, disinformation, and so on, with 3.5 million data points altogether, and with a crazy amount of peak traffic. So during the first few months last year, we had 15 terabytes of traffic of just intercommunicating with each other. So it was pretty heavy. As for the shift in the different topics, we saw initially there was a massive uptake of all three domains, basically. But with disinfo being much more important than nowadays, barely making it to the platform in last year. So this also showed that there was this heavy disinformation campaigns leading up to separate political events as well as also there being less good communication from the governments and so on about some of those facts that could be abused by simply the people not knowing about what's safe, what to avoid, are masks really important, and so on. So Alex?
Yeah, so see the reminder of Serge that you have to come in the end. So it really is the conclusion there. It's easy and straightforward, to be honest, to set up a utopical sharing community. And if you start with very small rules and a very light way of integration of rules, it can be very inclusive community. The thing is, it's very interesting to see that those different groups pop up at different bases, at regional level, local level, international level. And the thing is for us, it was like a huge, interesting experiment to get a lot of information how to improve the platform. For me, for example, for us, it was a kind of playground and laboratories to test new things and to evaluate for the dashboard, for example, self-registration and so on. And for us, being open source was really a quick way to adapt our tools very quickly and efficiently, and have to really test base with all those new users. And we have seen over the time this overlap between the different communities because a lot of things are interconnected. Thing that was a bit challenging and caused issue for us, it's initially we wanted to group everyone into a kind of a common group and organizations, but at the end it was better to have a kind of specific trust user per organization. So we moved those users into kind of groups. Then we were able to get kind of organization-based management. So we had some abuse at the beginning, but not much. So we had this kind of issue at the beginning where the taxonomy were not properly used or the classification of the data were not properly used. But when we started to involve people to create the taxonomies, to clearly set the data, they were doing the classification properly from the early on, and it was like a good move. So the thing is, at the beginning, we had like a huge urge of people joining and so on. And for us, we were like fixing stuff and increasing and creating new features at the same time. So we might have lost some people at the early beginning. So it's maybe something to take into consideration if you build from scratch a community when there's an urge or an urgency to do it. Yeah, next slide. Yeah. So I think the best thing that we can say is initially, and for us, it was like kind of a challenge. You should not be afraid to really step out of your comfort zone if you create a sharing communities. Don't be worried, to be agile, and try to support new type of threat. Initially, we were not experts in that field, but if you look at Bellingcat, for example, they were not experts in some field, but at the end, they became experts in their own specific field. So if you start to be involved and work in a sharing community, you start to learn and get more information. So removing specific controls provides freedoms, and people were able to collaborate and share information, especially when you have an urgency. People start to be, I would say, in good mood to operate. So the thing is, if you bootstrap, technically it's feasible, but don't forget about the load that you might have on the community management aspect. Is really key and really important if you want to operate one. So the thing is, it's quite interesting to see that dynamic sharing communities might move into different fields very quickly. So you have to cope with that, and it's especially in such kind of situations, it might, you see, the topic or the threat might evolve very very fast. Even in the next month, you might have different topics and so on. So MISP is, I think we had this kind of validation during this experiment that it was quite flexible. We had some serious deficiencies on self-registration, visualization, and so on that we overcome during the 1 year thing. So thanks to I would say the pandemic at the end, it was for us a very good step to improve the software and have new features. So, and I think the most important part and joining what FIRST is doing on a day-to-day basis is really there is good people in the community willing to assist, help others, and so on, and to share. So for us, it was like I think a good sign of the humanity and people working for the good will of everyone. Thank you very much for this session, and see you later in Q&A.
Thank you.
So also thank you to Alexander and Andras from my side about this kind of a little touring to another use. Yes, join our work adventure space to ask questions and talk to people, and stay tuned for more exciting talks. Thanks a lot, and
thank you very much. Take care.
Bye-bye.
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 Hi, Marco. We'll get started in a second. We're just waiting for the speaker.
Okay.
Sorry for the delay, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute.
Hey, Margot.
Hello.
Hello. Hi. Hey.
It's just us, right? We don't have people watching yet.
Not sure.
Actually, you do. We're live.
Oh, okay. So no
Margo,
more
if you
swear
want to
words.
go ahead and take over, and Sagita and Nicole, we appreciate you jumping in early. Our speaker at this moment didn't show up, so thank you. Margo, take it away.
Yes. So a little late, but hello, everybody. I'm Margot, and I'll be moderating this session. There will be a Q&A immediately following this presentation in Work Adventure, which is the conference virtual social platform. That's the same place where you can find the exhibitors and other social activities. So, thank you so much, Sagita and Nicole, for stepping up here and filling in, well, moving up your presentation. Sagita and Nicole are very well known in the community. Nicole Harris has worked for Géant the last 8 years as a project development officer. She's responsible, among other activities, for TFC Cert and the Transits Training Program, as well as NREN programs. Sigita Jokinaita, she will probably kill me for this pronunciation, is the director of the NRDCS Security Operations Center. She also has a background from Géant, managing cybersecurity projects and trainings worldwide. The talk, Don't You Know That You're Toxic? I'm very excited about this. They will highlight toxic behavior that renders organizations vulnerable and how to remedy this. So take it away.
Thank you, Margot.
Thank you. So hi, everybody. It's really a pleasure to be here with you today. As Margot says, my name's Nicole Harris, and I'm here with my ex-colleague, Sagita Jokinaita. We were normally typically known as Nikita over in the TFC Cert world, as people couldn't remember which one of us was which. But we're here to talk to you today, as Margot says, about some of the toxic behaviors we've seen within the security community and how we can move forward from them. One of the things that Sagita and I both have in common is that we were both humanities students. We studied humanities in various different degrees, but then came into the security and IT world through rather unusual routes. We now, between us, have over 18 years combined experience in the security community and in security projects. As Margot said, we've led security training and coordinated security training programs worldwide. We've been responsible for managing large-scale European projects and services in the security space. And as people most probably know us from, we've coordinated diverse security communities between us.
So despite of this experience and having been in the security world and in the community for quite a while, we still feel that because we come from a non-traditional background and we are both female in a very strong minority in this field, we have a unique perspective on how the security teams and organizations work, and the things in the security culture that can be labeled as toxic that we should avoid. So that's exactly what we want to present on today, and we have identified 10 of these behaviors.
Yep, so here are our top 10 toxic security behaviors. And we're talking generically about security teams, but we think these all actually relate specifically to CSERT and CERT teams as well. We want to say as well that we have overwhelmingly found lots of welcome in the community and seen lots of really great practices, but that doesn't mean there's nothing that needs to be changed out there. So in no particular order, our top 10 toxic behaviors that we've seen are security through obscurity, the myth of meritocracy, hero culture, ableist design, punitive education, security silos, culture of no, lack of diversity, loser attitude, and the blame game.
Yeah, and it's obviously not that we see that in every organization or in every team, but we think that all of you are going to identify at least some of them from your experience in the current culture or previous where you worked previously. So what we are hoping is that all attendees will see some of the behaviors and approaches that you can relate to, and then you will take at least one thing home that you can change and improve in your organization.
So I'm going to go up first and start with the myth of meritocracy. So the word meritocracy has been used for a really long time in our community, and it's typically seen as quite a positive force within security and in the IT industry. Most people seem to have forgotten that the person who coined the word, his name was Michael Young. He wrote an essay called The Rise of the Meritocracy. He really intended it to describe a dystopian future and not something we should try and emulate. I was actually introduced to this word really early on in my IT career. I was asked to work with a group of men who formed a development team for a well-used piece of software in the higher educational community, which I will of course not name. And they earnestly spent quite a lot of time explaining to me how they accepted coders onto the team on the basis of merit, and they were really proud to be a meritocracy. What they were really not able to see, though, was that their judgment of merit didn't really relate to the code or the work being delivered, but on the person type that they wanted on their team. And that person type was inevitably a white man of a certain age, with certain attitudes and certain beliefs. So the idea that all you need is kind of talent plus effort to succeed in your career has, I think, by now been well disproven, despite efforts of some people that say all we need to do is lean in and we'll be just fine. And we need to talk about privilege. Privilege is not necessarily the presence of money or power or advantage, but rather can simply be the absence of obstacles and the benefits of looking like someone who belongs within a community. And I think our community often strongly feels it is a meritocratic space, and that can sometimes be true. The rituals we go through to build trust with each other through organizations like FIRST, like TFC Cert, do seem to bear this out. However, even those who believe their actions and reactions are purely based on merit can often prioritize and select people that most aptly mirror the dominant group at the time. So in this process, we end up something that looks more like a meritocracy than a meritocracy, and then the cycle becomes self-selecting. One of the areas where this can become most pronounced is in recruitment, and there's some simple things we can do to improve that. Managers often look for someone who fits in with the existing team and is just like the existing team, and then falls into the trap of selecting the same sort of person over and over and over again. And we can do some simple checks to avoid this, such as running your job advert through online tools that look for balance and look for biased terms. And you can actively consider whether you need a different and diverse type of person in your team rather than another clone.
I have used one of those tools recently, and I feel like it was very useful in attracting more different applicants, at least, if not employees. The next thing that we identified that is part of this toxic team culture is the so-called hero culture. And just in general, there hasn't been enough research done on these toxic team cultures, but one of the people who has been researching this is called, let's go back, Janan Budge from Forrester. And in her research, she called out 10 leading causes of toxicity, and one of them was the hero culture. So she says that those individuals with a hero complex have a very negative impact on the team culture. So, you know, we're talking about the rock stars, the people who think that they know it all and they're the only ones who can solve a problem. But the real problem is that they're often not very good team players. And sadly, it's more prevalent than we think. So this hero culture, or having a hero person in your organization or your team, leads to two big problems. So one of them is the bottleneck. Then an employee, the hero employee, has a difficulty completing their task in a timely and effective manner because they simply take on too much work, thinking that they're the only ones who can do it, and they don't share the workload. But the second thing that is even more damaging is that this hero culture is the opposite of the team culture, which we all probably agree that is something that we want to strive for, working together in a more collaborative way. So having those heroes create a huge amount of dysfunction in your team or organization. The problem is that the heroes often have a fixed mentality. They're less likely to take risks because they fear failure, which means that they cannot learn from their mistakes. And what needs to be fostered instead of this fixed mentality is a growth mentality. And that can be achieved by, first of all, diversifying your workplace and putting experience and enthusiasm into the mix. And you get this enthusiasm from new people in the field. the new recruits who have some skills and capabilities that they can bring into your organization, possibly new ways of thinking, and new ways of communicating and new ways of collaborating. So one of the advice that we found on how to solve this problem is that if you have younger employees, or just say new employees in your organization, then one way of providing those new perspective and ideas to the hero people is to start reverse mentoring in your organization, where younger people or new people in our organization are mentoring the older people or the people who joined the organization first.
So our next toxic culture is about security through obscurity, which is a pretty well-known phrase. We typically apply it to approaches that keep the inner workings of system secrets. I think it's pretty widely disproven as an effective way to keep systems secure. However, it kind of tipped over into human behavior as well. The need to be obscure about projects or information related to security teams can be an easy sort of knee-jerk reaction to a perceived notion of keeping information secure. We can probably all agree that data classification is also, of course, an essential process within an organization. We always have documents that certain people should not access, privileges that certain users should not have. But that's very different from approaches where teams refuse to share information or give users adequate training or directions in the belief that keeping information secret is keeping information secure. This can become even more problematic when teams stop communicating important information up to managers. So having an excellent communications plan and actively ensuring that you're communicating is a key element for any kind of team, but very specifically for security teams. While CSERT teams often have really well-developed communication techniques for dealing with an incident, for example, they interact well with trusted CERT teams outside their organization to analyze and resolve issues, they can often be quite poor at internal communication, particularly in terms of management engagement and user engagement. And it's those kind of circumstances where transparency can be, in many senses, a bigger key to security than secrecy. To give an example here, one of the perhaps biggest security failures of the 20th century was the Space Shuttle's Challenger disaster in 1986. And although a technical fault was the underlying cause of the issue, the investigations into the disaster mostly pointed to communication issues as the biggest factor in the fallout. And the following issues were noted. There was a lack of communication with the press, which led to unhelpful speculation and incorrect information becoming fact and the perceived notion of the public. Problems were not communicated or discussed outside reporting channels. Sign-off was permitted without input from all of the appropriate teams and without proper briefings, and information being withheld from certain groups of engineers in the name of security. So in these scenarios, and in many of the scenarios we see in our working days, better attention to communication planning could have quite literally saved lives.
Yeah, the next example that we picked is punitive education. And I think that here we're talking about training, and we all agree that security training is very important on any budget with no money or huge budgets, but sometimes it can go really wrong. And a typical scenario where we see a lot of examples of that is phishing your own employees, not phishing, phishing. So in that scenario, a phishing email is sent, some employees will report it to you, some will inevitably click on the link and do the wrong thing, and then they will need to be punished. So either you would be telling them off or sending them some PowerPoints to look at, or a video about phishing, and that usually doesn't teach them anything, and it causes them to be embarrassed and humiliated. One of the recent controversial examples that illustrates this very well is from the UK, from West Midlands Trains, who emailed 2,500 employees with a message saying that they will get a one-off bonus as a thank you for working really hard during the COVID crisis. However, the people who clicked on the link, they got a message telling them that it was a company organized phishing simulation test, and there was not going to be any bonus. So it just told them that this was a test designed by their own organization, by their IT team, and this was a typical phishing type of link that promised financial reward. So West Midlands defended their actions and their decisions. They said that this email was just exactly the sort of thing that the criminals would use, but that kind of, that leads to our point that it doesn't need to be fake. We don't need fake emails or phishing emails, as we get them enough as is, without our employer actually paying someone to create those fake emails. And then most of the time, those kind of campaigns can just seem lazy and inconsiderate if they're aiming to train their employees. In some cases, like this one, that it's actually hurtful, and it really caused a lot of pain to these people, and it borderlines hazing rather than training. So, if you want to teach your employees or your colleagues that if you click on the link or you make a mistake and you're embarrassed, that's kind of okay. Embarrassment is a negative emotion, and it's a negative emotional response, but it's not as strong as being humiliated. As you see in this quote, humiliation is something that is being done to you. So being humiliated by your own employer is not going to, to lead to you learning something and being encouraged to behave in a different way, or at least not positively. So, suggestion is to move towards training that doesn't involve huge negative emotions and doesn't hurt people. Even if you want to use phishing in this kind of education, that's okay, but it shouldn't be followed by a punishment, but rather encouragement. So, for example, whoever reports those emails or those links gets a prize or some other gamification methods.
Thanks, Gita. So our next one up is, my slides keep on jumping.
It's blank.
It's blank. There we go. Yeah, of course it's blank.
No, your slide just said no to you.
No. And the next one up is the culture of no. So for those of you who have either a teenager in the house or a toddler in the house, I think you probably get enough of the culture of no at home, and you don't need it when you go to work. The quote in the slide is from a team at the UK government's National Technical Authority for Information Assurance. Try saying that quickly. And they say one of the most frustrating things we both hear is you can't do insert IT thing here for security reasons. In the report, which we can share with people, the authors go on to say that they often hear their own guidance that they wrote cited as a reason to say no to things. The other thing we often see in this space is not just saying no to things, but a process which makes everything more difficult in the name of security. And the authors note that in the report too. They talk of users seeing computers that take an age to boot up due to multiple security applications, internet access that blocks vast numbers of sites, restrictive lockdowns on smartphones that sometimes make them more like bricks than a productive device. And all of this in the name of security. I actually experienced something like this in a project a long time ago when we were supporting the NHS, where the smart cards that they'd introduced for staff to use to try and protect log-on systems and access to privileged data was so clunky to use and just took so much time for people to use and for the system to boot up that they ended up just using one person's card that was logged into the system all day because it was the only way they could access the health information they needed in the timely manner they needed to access it. So a default no or difficult processes don't necessarily equal good security at the end of the day. Getting back to my teenager versus toddler example, like any good helicopter parent, security teams can be so caught up in protecting their assets that they forget that the primary reason for the team to exist is actually to enable and support the organization to do things and not to bring it to a stop. Many good intentioned policies, processes, laws, regulations create exactly this kind of environment. An example I always give is my favorite topic, GDPR. One of the very first lines of GDPR states that it seeks to harmonize the protection of fundamental rights and freedoms of natural persons in respect to processing activities, and here's the whammy, and to ensure the free flow of personal data between member states. And that's Article 3 of GDPR, if anyone's interested in geeking out. I think in reality, we all know that the implementation of GDPR has done a lot more to break the free flow than to enable it and to ensure it, particularly within Europe and even globally. It doesn't mean that we're suggesting letting anyone do whatever they want, of course, it's all about balance. We'd suggest starting off a project or a reaction to a request by thinking about how we can say yes to this and meet our requirements for security and integrity. And if you start with that yes rather than no approach, it can start a better conversation than looking for ways to say no, even if it's not possible to facilitate everything at the end of the day.
Yeah, so the the next example is also related to a difficult conversation that needs to keep happening over and over again. And I'm sure that when we started this presentation, many of you thought that this is just going to be one of those women ranting about lack of diversity and lack of women in the security community. But we are still a minority, and we all sat in those meetings and conference room full of white men on laptops. And the Dave rule, which started as an insider joke in Silicon Valley, is now a kind of a running joke in other communities as well. And if you haven't heard it, then the rule is that once your work team includes as many women as it does people named Dave, then you have achieved acceptable gender balance. But we're not there yet. I don't know how many percentages of Daves there are in the security community, but there are currently around one quarter of the overall cybersecurity workforce female. And the situation is getting better. So in 2017, only 11% of study respondents were women. So we can say that more of them are joining. But the problem is that now we need them to stay. So it's not enough to attract more diverse. It could be women, could be other minorities. It's not enough to attract them into the community or into these organizations, but also we need them to stay. Because here, lack of diversity is both a cause of toxicity, but also an outcome. So a lot of people from the minorities, female and other minorities, noted that they feel like they're unable, or they just don't want to stay in the team anymore because of these toxic behaviors and toxic cultures. So what we can do is, of course, create policies. We can create engagement and career development plans for everyone that everyone can benefit from. And we can try to make workers feel more welcome that way. But really, the key in making everyone feel included and safe is just changing the culture. The organizational culture needs to be a priority. And professionalism and empathy must be expected and modeled from the highest management down.
Thanks for that, Sigita. And obviously at the moment it's Pride Month. And if you look on Twitter at the Women in Identity group, they have also tweeted out some really amazing stats this morning on representation of LGBTQ groups within the workforce as well. And that's really important that we look at as well. Moving on to another area that's closely related, though, is issues around ableist design. And the quote that's up on the screen is about CAPTCHA. I don't think it's going to amaze anyone to think that CAPTCHA is not perhaps the best thing to use when considering people with disabilities of any type. But when researching potential issues that security processes can create for people with disabilities, this particular W3C working group that were looking at the inaccessibility of CAPTCHA and alternatives to visual Turing tests on the web, which is a very catchy title, their findings really hit home, I think. Essentially, at the end of the day, our efforts to identify the difference between a computer and a human basically excluded people with disabilities from that definition of human. And that really struck home, and that really sucks. And we have to stop things like this. The problems with CAPTCHA are well documented and well talked about, but there are many, many different approaches we use to authenticate users that can automatically exclude certain groups of users. Some examples of that might be the requirement for a highly complex password string without providing a password manager that can work effectively with a screen reader, assistive app, or voice input software. That can immediately lock out users with vision impairments or users with learning disabilities. There was, again, I obviously spent some time on Twitter this morning, a really good string where one guy was really defending his position that all password managers were bad and evil and insecure. And he was looking at the attack surface of them. From a technical standpoint, he may have been 100% accurate, but he simply wasn't looking at the bigger picture in terms of usability and particularly around disability guidelines. Other issues that have come up repeatedly are issues with bias in facial recognition systems. That's achieved national news coverage. It's been the subject of extensive research by the Turing Institute. And when I was reading one of their reports, they actually noted that this kind of facial bias began all the way back in the 19th century with the development of photography. For generations, the chemical makeup of film was designed to be best at capturing light skin, surprise, surprise. Colour film was insensitive to the wide range of non-white skin types and often failed to show the details of darker skinned faces. I think we have to accept then that biometrics do not always offer the golden solution to flawed authentication processes. Again, we're recommending a really simple check here. When a new process, policy or procedure is put in place, every project should ask itself, who might we be disenfranchising with this work? What are the risks of vulnerable, disabled or underrepresented groups being accidentally locked out by these decisions? And what we're doing with this is taking the rather basic Turing test of human versus computer and really embracing a test that looks at all aspects of humanity.
The next behavior that we wanted to point out as toxic is the blame game or finger pointing. So when a significant big incident happens in an organization, the focus in a toxic environment immediately would go to who's the one to blame. And this type of organization looks for a scapegoat, and eventually, more often than not, someone gets fired. So this is even more prevalent now when many of those security cases are becoming more public due to the overall increase in legal action. And as a result, many more CISOs or similar type of positions in organizations, they get their contracts terminated as a result. So Nominate study has found out that an average tenure of a CISO is less than 3 years. And even more, nearly a third of the respondents say that it's less than 2 years. So one of the things that you can do is to analyze the average tenure of your security leadership. And if it turns out to be less than 3 years, or even worse, less than 2 years, this could be a warning sign that maybe your culture needs to change. But Nominate also did a CISO stress report last year in 2019, and the vast majority of CISOs, 88%, claim that they are moderately or tremendously stressed at work. And 1/3 of them said that stress affected their ability to do their job. So what happens here is they're stressed. They're stressed because their job, and then they're more likely to make a mistake. And because they make mistakes, they get fired, and then it's like an endless circle. So another thing that was really worrying is that 95%, almost all of the interviewed CISOs said that they work more than their contracted hours, and 87% of them said that working additional hours was expected by their organization. So that obviously can lead to high rates of burnout. And it just signifies a failure in overall organization leadership. Which shows that changing this and making it a more positive culture, it becomes more crucial than ever, because all of these CISOs are just going to burn out one day, and who's going to take responsibility. So what we advise to do is monitor employees' mental health, promote work-life balance, and then things go wrong, and things will go wrong, because it doesn't matter how hard you work, incidents happen. We suggest to use blame-free tools such as hot wash sessions, where you just discuss what went well, what you could improve, and definitely avoid pointing fingers like this guy in the slide does.
So moving on from your employees to how you might entreat other users within your organization and maybe externally is loser attitude. And this is the definition of people talking about a painfully annoying, stupid or irritating computer user. And yeah, we all know them, we all experience them every day. Users can be a complete pain to work with. They can be very, very frustrating. Getting users to understand that security measures you want to put in place and why they're necessary can be really problematic. There's the old adage of the problem exists between the keyboard and the chair, and we get it. However, if you immediately go into every interaction with your users with this attitude, the conversation immediately starts off on the wrong foot. If we combine this with some of the other attitude challenges we've talked about here in this presentation, hero culture, culture of no, blame game, the interactions between security staff and users can quickly become fraught and lead to some very, very common problems. If you assume that all users are stupid, you assume you don't need to explain anything to them because they're too stupid to understand the directions, right? Security patches, processes and requirements can often be barked out as orders with the assumption that the user should follow the commands blindly because security. Busy users may simply ignore instructions as they don't feel they have the information to process, or can even feel insulted by the lack of information shared because, you know, they perhaps don't think they're as stupid as you do. Taking the time to give users a really brief overview of why a measure has been brought in, what the impact is, how it can help them, this can quickly avoid resentment and can quickly avoid a breakdown in communication and interaction between teams. Loser attitude and snapshot judgments of user abilities can also lead to other toxic behaviours, especially if left to an individual staff. In one of my early job roles, our team was somewhat of a satellite team supported by one guy from a university IT department. We were not allowed admin rights on our laptops, fairly common at the time, but some discretion was given as the job roles performed by my team weren't typical user profiles. The way this IT guy decided to apply that discretion was to allow admin rights to all the men within the team, but not to any of the women.
That was a long time ago, right?
It was a while ago now.
Hopefully that changed, but that's still a very good illustration of how that can go wrong. So the last example that we chose of toxic behaviors, or in this scenario, perhaps a toxic security personality type, is then security manager is isolated, and he or she doesn't like to listen to the actual business side of the discussions. They don't try to learn the unique challenges of operations teams and business managers. For them, secure is secure, period, and the context doesn't matter. The risks don't matter, and you know this attitude just leads them to becoming irrelevant, or at least isolated. So security managers or security teams could be an entire team who behave in this way, or who has this attitude. They just make enemies of themselves in organization, and create boundaries between security and the rest of organization. And what needs to happen if we really want to achieve our goals is the opposite. You know, security team and security people need to become an integral part of the organization and help people do their jobs in a secure manner, but rather than preventing them from completing some tasks. And by making things more secure, think about how to make the colleagues' lives easier and rather than more difficult. But all of that requires understanding of the organization, of the industry, of the context. And for that, security leaders or security people need to be more open. They need to be more networked in the organization and more transparent with the rest of the organization. And in that way, we can create a proactive rather than reactive security culture. So those are the 10 problems that we identified, but we don't want to just talk about problems. As I said at the beginning, we would like you, each one of you, to take at least one piece of homework home and try to change something. So we prepared a quick solution slide for you as well. And the first one is diversity. We mentioned it many times. This word was mentioned many times in our presentation. And it's not something that is just going to happen if we sit here and wait for more different people to join cybersecurity. We really need to have a deliberate and well thought out diversity and communication plan. And some organizations have already done that, so we can consult the community on that and diversify our teams in that way.
So the second point is to support and manage positive team culture. And it's not just enough to allow the team culture to grow organically. You need to really put some thought and effort into planning to making a team culture that's positive, both within the team itself and in its interactions with other teams within the organization.
We suggest that you empower rather than belittle our users. So ideally, we all want everyone in our organization and our communities to be security conscious. But for that to happen, we need to stop thinking and making the users feel like they're the weakest link and include them in all things security instead.
And to go alongside that, you really need to have a meaningful training program tailored not only to your organization, but tailored to your users, and one that the users can enjoy participating in.
And the last advice is work on how to say yes and I like this one because it comes from improv theater, where you always say yes and. So we're not saying that you always need to say yes immediately, but before you say no, make sure that it's definitely a no, and at least genuinely try to find a solution to their problem before denying them whatever request that was sent to you. And that's it.
that's the end of our presentation. And I think we're slightly over time. And I believe we go to over to Work Adventure for questions.
Yes, thank you so much, Sigida and Nicole. And as Nicole mentioned, there will be a Q&A immediately following this presentation in Work Adventure. So I encourage you to go there. This breakout stream 3 will be cut short, and we're really sorry about that, but we encourage you to join breakout stream 1 or 2, where breakout stream 1 is surviving a ransomware attack, lessons from the field. Speaker is Peter Moran, and the content type is technical advanced. Breakout stream 2 is DNS under attack, the miscreants of offensive playbook with a defensive counter, which is management and beginner by Barry Green. So with that, I will join the Q&A, and thank you.
I will see you there.
Yeah.
See you there.